tying today the fly called the Strymph, which is a fun little streamer slash nymph imitation. A number of years ago, a gentleman by the name of Harry Murray wrote, in my opinion, one of the best books on fly fishing for smallmouth. In that, he had a write-up on this fly that he created called the Strymph, which is kind of a cross between a streamer and a nymph. As you can see, it has a streamer profile to it, so you could swing this down through the currents or just under the surface or even down near the bottom as a streamer, but you could also fish this, tight line or under an indicator or something as a nymph. It's an interesting fly. Ostrich herl for the tail. The body is generally made out of rabbit, but you could use some wool, or there are some synthetics out there, yarns and things like this that you could wrap on there and trim to shape with a little hackle on the front. So that is Harry Murray's Strymph, and I'll get started. So I'm going to start the Strymph by placing my hook in the vise. This is a Mustad R74. The old number was a 9672. It's a 4X long streamer hook. You could do this with a shorter streamer hook if you want just a little shorter body. First, I'm going to, after I debarb the hook, I'm going to attach my lead. I'm using a lead-free 0.025 for this. It's up to you. It all depends on how much weight you want to give this. You could not have hardly any weight on it, and it would just kind of be like a streamer down underneath the surface of the water. But if you're wanting to swing this as a streamer deep in the water or fish it as a nymph, then I'm going to put on about 15 wraps of this lead. Smooth off the tag ends of those. And I'm going to leave them right about in the middle of the hook shank, maybe a little forward. Now I'm going to attach my thread. For thread, I'm using a UTC 140 Denier in an olive color. And that's just because the overall fly is an olive color. If I were doing this in a brown, I'd use a brown thread, a black thread, so on. Attach my thread behind the eye of the hook, run it down to the lead, then in open spirals, cross the lead and behind. And here I'll just put in a thread dam behind the lead and in front. Not a big one. It does two things. It does help lock that lead in place along the hook shank, but it mostly gives me a nice transition. This way, when I'm wrapping in the body, I don't end up with a ledge where, as I'm wrapping in, it drops over and maybe I end up with a gap. Now for the tail on the Strymph, it is Ostrich herl. If you've seen the video that I did on the Murray's Hellgrammite, it explains in there a little bit why he uses ostrich over, say, a regular marabou. But this is ostrich in here, and the nice thing is these are really, really long, so you can cut out a dozen, maybe 15, 16 herls. I can take those by the butt ends here, collecting them all together, and tie those on the shank. Wrap those down. You don't have to worry about a little bulk or mess on the underbody here because the rabbit fur that is the body will cover it up. Then I want to cut these more or less about a hook length for the tail. And I'm just going to cut those straight across. Doesn't matter that it has a nice sharp cut there. You could try and break those off if you want something a little bit more ragged looking. But the nice thing is with these long clumps, I have another clump of ostrich here for another fly if I so choose. For the body for the Strymph, we're going to use some rabbit fur. I'm actually going to use some of this olive rabbit fur. This is a half skin that's already cut into zonker strips, but I like the extra black in here. Just adds a little bit of spotting in the body. You could cut it right off of the zonker strip if you want, if that's easiest for you, and put it in the dubbing loop. I'm actually going to just take some tufts right from the base where this skin is not cut. This makes it a little easier. So first I have to make my dubbing loop. My dubbing loop is just maybe about 2 to 3 inches long. It's not very long at all. I lock that in. I wrap my thread up the hook shank just to get it out of the way. Take my dubbing loop tool, insert it into the loop, and then I'm taking some dubbing wax and putting some on both sides. This dubbing wax is different than the thread wax that I use. You'll see me wax my thread and put this on here. It's a different wax. It's much tackier. And the reason is when we put that fur inside that loop and close the loop on it, we don't want that fur to slide around in the thread wraps. If you're new to doing dubbing loops like this, or I should say making a dubbing brush out of, say, rabbit or some other synthetic or fur, just do it in small clumps. Get you a clump off of the hide that is something that's not too big for you to manage. Slide that into the thread like this, and then you're going to want to spread that out. So you just can gently pinch it, and if you can, slide it off to one side. You want it offset to one side. Now, I have some shorter fibers here in the back, and that's fine. But we're going to trim all of this when it comes time to finish the fly. Once you have that little batch in there, you can twist up your dubbing brush. Then we're going to apply it. You want to brush any loose hair out like this. This one's kind of sparse, and it's mostly because I want to show and demonstrate how to create a dubbing brush with this rabbit. And then the other ones that I do will be a little bit thicker and a little bit longer, and that's just to proceed through the process. You do want to stroke the hairs in a backward direction or rearward direction as you come around, so you're not trapping any of the hair along the hook shank. It'll just help the fly be a little bit fuller. Each wraps right in front of the other until you reach the end of that dubbing loop. You get to the end of that loop, unwrap your thread back down to the loop, and then we bind in basically the tag of that loop. We can trim that away. So that's how you make a dubbing brush. You could put a spot of glue right there if you want to, but that's pretty solid. I'm going to go ahead and I'm not going to make you suffer through watching me make each and every dubbing loop here. I will add in basically just some highlights as I progress up the process here, and we'll get this body all done. rabbit body the length that I want, I'll secure that dubbing loop in and tie it off. You'll notice that I didn't try to apply this last little bit. I could have, but I intentionally did it this way and loaded that up a little bit more. I wanted to show you that if you happen to get the body that you want and you still have some of that dubbing loop left, you just simply tie it in and then just cut the excess off. You don't have to use all of it. Now I'm leaving about an eye length behind the eye of the hook for our hackle. I'm going to smooth this up a little bit so I have a smooth area for the hackle that's in front of this. And then I'm going to put in a 3-turn whip finish, and this is just security, because if I, while I'm trimming this, happen to clip the thread, I don't want that unraveling. Not that it would unravel that far. So, as I mentioned, part of the tedious part is the dubbing loop and the making the dubbing brushes with the rabbit. Rabbit is, let's put it this way, rabbit and I have an ambivalent relationship because it's great stuff. I love it in the water and everything. But doing it like this, you can see rabbit hair floats all over the place, and I'm sneezing and my nose is itching for hours. So it is what it is. But now comes the trimming part. Just to get any hairs that might have been squished down or trapped down a little bit, I'm going to rub this the opposite direction, just back and forth a little bit, fluff that all out. You can use a comb if you want to, but this is generally good enough. So the Strymph, it basically has the same body characteristics as a Shanks white streamer, if you've ever tied one of those. We're going to make this into kind of a minnow shape. You can make it in more of a conical shape, where it's narrow back here and broader up at the front, but it's all like a cone, so it's all around like a cone. I prefer it's a little easier just to go ahead and keep a basic minnow shape. First thing you're going to want to do is come in and cut the bottom section. You'll always know that the bottom section is going to be flat in this fly because it's kind of like a bait fish. So we'll trim that flat, fairly flat, not completely finished yet, but that gets that started. Next, the sides, because the sides of a minnow tend to be flat as well. Notice that I'm cutting at a little bit of an angle. I want a taper here. Eventually, we're going to have more of a taper, like that minnow shape, where it's fatter up front and narrower in the back. Now I'm going to switch over to the other side. There's that hair floating all over the place. And same thing. I am using the vise and my thumb here as kind of a aid to stabilize my scissors. Like any sculpting, you're going to want to do this in stages, taking a little off at a time as you finally get down to the size and shape that you're looking for. Definitely need some nice sharp scissors for this, because this rabbit hair will tend to, instead of cut, it will just flatten in between the blades of the scissors if they're not very sharp. Even if they're sharp, it'll tend to do that. So we're just going to keep doing this. Keep trimming this a little bit, getting this tapered shape that we're looking for. Could even round the edges a little bit from the sides to the bottom. Trim this a little bit closer just to flatten it. You want to keep that nice and smooth and flat. And that's mostly also to open up the gap of the hook. That's closed off, and this hair really wouldn't close it off that much, but if it is closed off, it just makes it harder to set the hook, and then your fishing is frustrating. At some point, you just have to say, this is enough. You're not going to get, a perfect smooth hair body like maybe you would with deer hair on this, because this is the rabbit. You'll have some spots where the rabbit's a little denser and some where it's a little thinner, but it doesn't matter. It has the same profile in the water, and it's going to look really well. So that's pretty much it for our body. Get a few stray hairs here. Now, the face, I am going to put a little bit of a taper in the face going back instead of having that abrupt, tall, flat face. But I do want to keep it fairly smooth and flat up here, because our hackle is basically going to go in and be wrapped up against it. So for a hackle on this, I'm just using this is a Grizzly hen saddle. You could use a speckled hen if that's what you have. Pretty much it's up to you. I prefer to tie these in where the barbs are maybe about 1.5 times to 2 times the length of the gap of the hook. When those wrap in, I don't want these so huge that they then sweep back over. I mean, the Strymph, the idea behind the Strymph is that it is a nymph and or streamer fly, depending on how you fish it. If you make these, my opinion is, if you make these hackle barbs too long, then you're removing the nymph portion, and it's basically just a streamer. However, if you're fishing this fly and that's predominantly how you're going to fish it, then certainly you could. I think there's some videos out there, people using some mallard flank for the hackle up here, so it almost looks more like a Gartside soft hackle, but that's up to you. So I'm going to peel away the fluff. Taking my hackle pliers, I'm going to grab the hackle by the tip, stroking those barbs in a rearward direction just to give me a little anchor. Cut that off, a little triangle right there, and I'll wrap my thread back, and I shall anchor that right up against that rabbit, leaving my thread right there to help wrap that hackle in. Attach my hackle pliers. I'll probably get 2 to 3 wraps. It just depends on the length of the feather and how full you want it to look. Stroke those hackle barbs back as you wrap this in. So I'm going to go ahead and go with the whole hackle, which is about 4 wraps. I'm going to sweep all this back, start wrapping down from the eye backwards, making a small head on this. Ideally, you want those barbs trapped up against the face so that they stick out a little more perpendicular, but even if they don't, sweeping back isn't bad. I mean, you're going to be fishing this as a streamer and or a nymph. Pop that off. Clean this up a little bit. Put in a 4 to 5 turn whip finish. And our Strymph is done. You can fluff some of these hackles back out more of a perpendicular direction if you want, but once this hits the water, those are basically going to kind of come to life and do what they want to do anyway. So you can see where the nice thing with this fly is that you can swing this as a streamer, just like you would, say, a woolly bugger or any other small little streamer. Or you could put this under a strike indicator and you could bounce this down through a riffle or a little hole, a back eddy, or along a current seam or something like that. So it kind of does double duty, which is the nice thing. Good colors on this are the olive. At least I've found brown, black is also really good. And you could do these in a white, and like I said, fish them like you would a Shanks white streamer. So there is Gary Murray's Strymph. Thank you for watching. Thanks for joining me at the Vise today. I hope you learned at least a new pattern, if not a new technique, maybe a tip or trick here and there. If you have any questions about this fly or any of the techniques used in constructing this pattern, please leave them in the comments section down below. If you go to the trouble to ask a question, I'll go to the trouble to answer it. If you'd like to help dressed irons, please share this video with your friends and anybody you think that might enjoy this pattern. Until next time, remember, it's fly tying. If you're not having fun, then you're doing it wrong.